The theme of Faith in Businesses webinars and indeed the retreat this year is investment. Now, the topic of investment is very broad and deep and covers many aspects, as will all our series of Faith in Business monthlies. But to help us to get to grips with the underlying issues, we must consider questions such as who is doing the investing? What is being invested? How, where, what, and why should we invest? And how does our investment help others? And that's particularly interesting if you're involved in social enterprise or impact organizations. But what constraints are there to the way we can invest? And importantly, for us as Christians, how is our approach influenced by our faith? Now, the questions and the answers given will depend to some extent on the size of the company or other organization that we're going to be investing our time, talents, and treasures in, and whether we're actually using the money or the resources provided to us as investments, or whether we're going to be doing the investing ourselves. Now, many of you, like me, work in small startup businesses, and those, as you know, are initially funded by the entrepreneurial founders. They're largely responsible to themselves for how they use their own resources. But later on, as they grow, they're going to need funding from other places, whether that's banks or business angels. And as they add more and more investors, so these people are going to have a different perspective on what good investment is and what sort of returns are required. On the other hand, larger organizations depend on institutional funding. They're much more visible. They need larger sums of finances, and the institutions in turn are responsible to the people who provide money to them. And so both company and institution need to demonstrate returns to their respective investors. And what these returns relate to and the required level is, of course, the subject of much discussion. And it's great that our two speakers today are going to be speaking from a background in institutional funding, but are going to be addressing the remarks particularly to the needs of smaller businesses. And in so doing, they're going to show that investment decisions are much more than just about maximizing returns. Ethical considerations are important too, and indeed they're essential, which is what they're going to be talking about now. So our first speaker is Andrew Harper, an ordained minister who joined Epworth Investment Management in April 2021 as head of ethics, and was responsible for all matters related to ethical thought leadership and ethical performance. And then after Andrew, Barbara Ridpath, who followed a career in finance and then spent 4 years running the St. Paul's Institute on Ethics and Finance at St. Paul's Cathedral, is going to speak. Barbara currently chairs the Church of England's Ethical Investment Advisory Group. And so you can see between them the backgrounds, the interests, the areas of action fit in well with obviously the subject that we're on about. And in their different roles, both speakers combine their industry knowledge with Christian ethics to help rethink how finance can serve both the people, the community, and the common good. So please join me in welcoming Andrew and then Barbara to speak on investing as an act of witness. And so first of all, it's over to you, Andrew. Welcome.
Thanks, Ken, and thanks to the forum for having me. It's great to be here and great to see so many faces that are interested in this topic, and hopefully after I speak, you remain interested in the topic. So as a kid, I wore this ridiculously colored, bright wristband that said WWJD on it. What would Jesus do? Inscribed around it. And it served as a reminder of a Sunday school lesson on the topic of God's sovereignty and will over my life. And on many occasions, it did cause me to consider, I didn't always listen as a kid, but it did cause me to consider, what would Jesus do in this moment? How would Jesus want me to act in this situation? And at a young age, this simple bit of words on a cheap, brightly colored wristband laid an ethical foundation for life. And so today I carry that same lesson into my role at Epworth Investment Management. And I think it's a message that we in all areas of business can benefit from remembering. You see, as Christians, we of course believe that God cares about all aspects of our lives. including how we manage our money. And as leaders in business guided by Christian principles, our role is to be more than managers of a business, but rather stewards of business. And it's that mindset, it's that heart set, it's that soul set, if you will, that mindset of stewardship that makes us ask the incredibly tough questions, like that on that simple wristband. What would Jesus buy? How would Jesus treat this customer? How would Jesus act in this situation? How would Jesus invest this bit of money? So how would Jesus act? Well, as asset managers, I'm always gutted that the scriptures don't give us divine stock picks, nor do the scriptures give us an exact set manual for how to undertake business activity. Instead, scripture outlines a set of godly principles for moral living and calls us to be close adherents. And through God's word, we are encouraged to look holistically at creation, from people to planet. We are tasked with being in solidarity with the oppressed, calling out injustice, and actively working towards restoring God's creation. Now, with all this God talk, some people around us in the business world may consider a Christian-led business or a Christian-led investment mindset a niche enterprise. And perhaps your clients or your business partners or your stakeholders or those you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis are not people of faith. So why should they care about what Christians have to say about business and investment? I think a critical part of being led by Scripture is to be a public advocate for its teachings. We all know, those of us who have a faith, know that adhering to faith, not without its deep challenges, leads to a deeper and more fruitful life. And we are all aware of the positive impact potential that godly direction can have on people and planet. So I think what we can rightly say to people, those who may not be Christians, challenging us, is fundamentally, we're not so different, you and I. We care about what you care about. Outside of the realm of metaphysics, Jesus can arguably be considered one of the world's most notable humanitarians and champions for justice. And his teachings can really be universally applied to many areas of life and business and investment decision-making. And throughout his ministry, Jesus remained deeply concerned for the least of these, the marginalized and the poor. And he called us to radically love our neighbor, to do no harm, and reminded us that creation itself was a gift from God. So carrying out that love for people and planet that Christ taught us, Christian business must carry on the legacy of Jesus. We must strive to address the climate emergency. We must strive to seek tax justice. We must strive to end modern slavery, improve the health and nutrition of God's people on earth, and address all sorts of injustice around the world. I also think Christians have a bit of license to speak on ethical issues. The Christian faith is, as we all know, if we even take a little bit of a dive into Christian history, is steeped in moral challenges and changes. Christian-led business, therefore, should be led by centuries of ethical thought and debate that have been carried out in the church. That's not to say that we don't care about the bottom line. On the contrary, We aim to grow the bottom line, like all businesses. It is to say, however, that before any action, we draw upon the wealth of this collective knowledge, this legacy of the saints, and carefully consider the moral and spiritual implications. Our history, therefore, must inform our decision-making and helps us navigate what we're seeing as increasingly complex moral challenges. I think as Christian business leaders, we've also got a lot riding on this. We don't just have earthly stakeholders to answer to. We've got heavenly stakeholders. And so a Christian business ethic must be rigorous, as if life itself depended on it. If our decisions are ethically dubious, sure, we disappoint our clients, we disappoint our stakeholders, but importantly, we disappoint God. All that we do should serve God and stakeholder. And this is the tension, the very heart of the ethical tension that we must hold when looking at investments. Every decision we take, every strategy we implement must be thoroughly researched and rooted in our Christian ethic and be balanced against our stakeholder tolerance. And God, as stakeholder, encourages the Christian-led business to strive to be moral, ethical, and spiritual custodians of God's resources on earth. You know, I often in day-to-day life get asked if I really believe in all of this God stuff. Whether I really believe this God stuff can make a difference in the investment and business world. I like to think I'm not wasting my time. So my answer is always a resounding yes. Of course I believe it. And whether we're dealing with Christians or non-Christians or people of other faith, a Christian ethical approach can prove to be an invaluable resource when pursuing moral returns. I like to think our approach at Epworth pushes us to speak on behalf of the poor, the marginalized, and the planet. I hope that our work at Epworth is defined and categorized by its fruits. Being guided by Christian principles means we don't just speak out on injustice for moral brownie points, but rather we need to find within ourselves and at the very root of our businesses a deep authenticity and integrity that desires real redemptive change. And I'm talking about the real redemptive change that not only satisfies people's eternal needs, but satisfies their needs here on earth, that helps alleviate those in poverty, that helps alleviate the climate crisis. The heart of it all, we really can't be afraid to ask, what would Jesus do? Because that's the toughest question. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew, and good afternoon, everybody. As a terrible multitasker, I will confess that much of what I'm going to say is part of something I did earlier. So I'm holding this up because this edition of Crucible is entirely on ethical investment. If it's something that interests you, I now have to confess it's behind a paywall, and you can get one article for free registering, or you can buy one edition without subscribing. So it's kind of embarrassing, but at least, you know, you'll know whether you've heard it before and you need to read it. How we use our money is an outworking of our beliefs and an act of witness. And I think that's true for all of us, whether we're individuals, entrepreneurs, SMEs, or large businesses. as well as communities, churches, and secular institutions. In every instance, we have both the right and the responsibility to speak into the public debate and to help to develop a shared understanding of the values that are important to us as a society. As Christians, our values are grounded in our beliefs and our theology, though that can be quite a broad church, as I have discovered in the Church of England, with many different interpretations of what these beliefs include and the way they're lived. Working with others who share similar beliefs and principles helps our money create an enormous force for change. We have seen this over time in many areas. Leadership from the church has played an integral role in the growth of the ESG, environmental, social, and governance movement in the United Kingdom and beyond. Yet the moral leadership that comes from the church is not without its own perils. We risk being caught in contradictions between what we say and what we do, and some of the most fraught disagreements are among people all trying to do good with different approaches to what is right and how to achieve change. I think it's also important that we must remember that companies like people are capable of change and redemption. So we need to be prepared to re-engage when we see positive change if our views are to have impact. Third, there may be a strong difference between what an individual believes is a right action and what the institutional church does. Most recently, this was manifested in the climate change debate, where some church members took exception to the national investing bodies continuing to hold shares in some companies that were either major polluters or oil and gas companies. So I'm not going to spend time on that because that's not today's debate, but it's a second very interesting conversation. But the church more broadly has myriad ways of engaging. There are grassroots campaigns on social issues such as refugee policy and providing homes for refugees. The Green Church movement is helping churches around the world make their churches more environmentally friendly and helping to raise awareness of key climate change issues. And the moral authority of the church speaking into issues can be very important. Businesses can also engage, ranging from the first principles about our purpose, culture, and values to whether we hire fairly and in an unbiased way, pay a living wage, treat employees fairly, and so on. Let's come back to that at the end. What I'd like to do now is very briefly touch on the principles the EIAG uses in all its work, because I think they will be helpful for each of you in framing what you do in business. The first principle is that God would like us to flourish as persons. That is, we are given freedom in order to flourish, even if we can also use that freedom to do evil. We are given irredeemable dignity, which must be protected and shouldn't be threatened or undermined. We are asked to flourish in relationship. We are naturally social beings. Whatever enhances relationship will enable flourishing. Whatever harms relationship or causes hatred or division will diminish them. We are asked to stand with the marginalized throughout the Bible. And we are asked to serve the common good. Last of all, as Andrew mentioned, we are called very clearly to be stewards of God's creation. So with those 5 principles in mind, you don't often need a lot of detailed advice about how and what to do. You just base it from that. Though it gets pretty complicated than when you have to think it through in different industries. Now, the EIAG puts all of its advice available to the public on its website. I grant you it is largely intended for institutional investors, but we're aware that many other church members and other bodies use it to ground their own thinking. Making this advice public is a key way that we punch above our weight in terms of ethical investing, as the EIAG advice, together with the policies of the national investing bodies, informs the positions of a wide range of other investors around the world. To conclude, if we wouldn't do something, we should consider whether we want others to do it on our behalf, whether that relates to products they buy, where they invest, either as individuals or business people. Careful consideration of the issues may rethink our purchasing and investing accordingly, but I'm aware this can be difficult and exhausting. when you're trying to live out your faith on a daily basis. So I would urge you all to be very gentle with yourselves. Begin with either the most egregious issues or those that concern you most, or start small to feel like you're making some successes. I think, and the analogy I like best is much like prayer, thinking about the consistency of your behaviors with your beliefs gets easier with practice. And the more you do it, the more it becomes a habit and a lens through which you look at all you do. So I hope in the discussion we can link back to that and find some good examples where you can teach us what you've been doing that has worked well for you. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for that, Barbara, and thank you, Andrew, for your talk earlier on. There's obviously quite a bit of overlap there, which emphasizes the fact that we can't just be Christians on a Sunday morning, but we're Christians and we should be thinking, what would Jesus do throughout our working week? As we understand more about what would Jesus do by reading the Bible, by hearing from other Christians, then we can start using that lens through which we can see our work and what we do in terms of investment in the right perspective. So there have been a number of questions that have been raised. Ultimately, the whole point about both of these talks, I think, is what would Jesus do? What would you do? And what have you been challenged to do in your workplace? But there's a question from Grant Smith. Grant, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Ken. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for that chat. So I put a brief description. I can understand why Ken said, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question personally? Fundamentally, in impact investing, when you're coming at it from a spiritual dimension, when you're coming with faith-driven investment or even faith-driven entrepreneurship, there's got to be a balance between the impact that you're making and the financial return. If you're managing money, you've clearly got to make a financial return. But for myself, I build affordable houses in Kenya. And when I say affordable houses, I'm talking about an alternative to a tin shed in Kibera slum. And therefore, in order to create an alternative for a tin shed in Kibera slum, you've got to create a rent-to-own structure which is affordable. If the rate of financial return is at a particular level, it actually just can't happen because your costs are higher than your rate of return. But it would be extremely redemptive, would be releasing the poor, and would have great impact on those individuals who currently are living in a tin shed, when you actually could be creating a formal structure for them and an asset which would become their asset which they grow. And therefore, Andrew, the question I'm asking is, how do you balance the impact, the releasing of the poor, the redemptive element of investment, and the financial return that you need to achieve in order to survive or to run your business?
Yeah, I think you ask the fundamental question we're all seeking to answer in this world. I think first, I applaud you for your work. I worked the last 6 years in sub-Saharan Africa before I joined Epworth. So, and a lot of that time was spent in Eastern Africa, particularly Kenya and Uganda. So I know the challenges you're facing there and kind of the tight margins you're running on, and to make any to attempt a greater kind of ethical approach can seem to be really costly to the bottom line. And for many activities it is. I think there's something to be said about starting really small, what Barbara alluded to in her talk, about just doing something very small consistently. I also think there's something where, for our particular business model, it may not just work right now. But what we can do is encourage and pray for others who are in that space through conversations like this Faith in Business Forum. Yeah, it's an incredible challenge. I mean, I think we also don't get it right every time, and that's also okay. I really like what Barbara said about not being hard on yourself. And we're operating in a very imperfect market. And we're being asked to kind of inject perfection into imperfection, inject the godly into something that resists the godly. And to do that, we're not always going to get it right. There are going to be times when we can all look at the same issue and come up with different answers. There are going to be times when we make grave mistakes in errors in our investment decisions. So I think it's about giving it your best shot, finding even the very small places where you can make a difference, being proud of that, encouraging yourself and your organization around that, and then encouraging others who possibly can do more to do more.
If I may interject, Grant, I think it's also something that was coming up just before the call, was which sectors are meant for profit of any kind, and where some sectors are actually better adapted to the not-for-profit model, where you're just trying to make enough to cover your costs. And I don't know anything about the affordable housing sector in Kenya, so I'm not even going to try and go there. But if you look at the housing associations in here in the UK, most of them are run on social models. They're not for profit businesses. And that's what, and that's so the money that does come in can be reinvested. And so getting the business model that best suits what you're trying to do right is often one of the key things. We were talking about France, where there's a scandal in the housing for the elderly market. Probably wasn't the right place to try a for-profit model. And so I think those are the things that have to be reflected on. You can still, there are places you can do mixed economy kind of models, but getting the setup of the business right and the business model right with what you're trying to achieve is almost key.
Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for that. It was certainly a very stimulating question. And indeed, if you want to know more about some of the challenges that Grant was referring to, then he's got an excellent book out, The Unexpected Social Entrepreneur. But linked to what Grant was asking, Roger Fairhead has made the point that it was good to hear about the emphasis on the bottom, more than just the bottom line, but on the planet and people and so on. And the question from Roger is really, do you have any advice on how we can actually measure, report and improve our investment in the people and planet aspects, given that this is something that both the investors and the investees would be tasked with should they get investment? So perhaps, Barbara, with your experience at the EIAG, you might have a couple of suggestions.
Well, it actually goes back farther than that. I spent most of my career in a rating agency, and they're all making bundles, trying to come up with ways of comparing these apples and pears for people right now in the ESG space, because the businesses themselves can't. They haven't yet come up, particularly on environmental issues. They're struggling, and I think will struggle even more on things like social conditions. So you can get measurements about whether people are paying the living wage. You can get pay differentials. You can get, but they're often defined, with the exception of the living wage, they're often defined differently by each company. So anything you can do to get these companies to come up with common reporting standards is enormously helpful. And also, based on this horrible scandal in Paris that I'm dealing with right now, one of the things that another ethical committee I sit on is thinking about doing is just not investing in anyone who we believe is insufficiently transparent. So if you can't get the information you need, then there's a reason they don't want to give it to you, and you need to think hard about that. So I think almost the first step on the ladder is the transparency.
Yeah,
I would just add as well, if I can, Ken. There's so many metrics out there, and you can find the right metric to suit your intended outcomes. You know, as a researcher, you know, it's just a big no-no. You know, you want to start with the hypothesis and find evidence to support that, rather than find the evidence first. So what I like to think of at Epworth is that it's more than a metric, that there are people, actual people's lives behind these numbers. So what we're trying to do really is to gather stories, to talk to people who are impacted by some of the decisions that we're making as investors, some of the engagement activity we're making as investors, and to help use those stories to help retrain our board and our clients, so they can begin to start to see some of the social capital they're starting to build, some of the environmental capital they're starting to build, some of the impact capital that goes alongside their growth. So it's a bit of a retraining. And there's a great set of works by a German-American theologian named Jörg Rieger. And so I'd really recommend, he's right now looking at a cooperative society, circular economies, things like that. But he's got some great texts, No Rising Tide being one of those. But I think it's about reframing how we see the markets to include the profits of bettering people's lives.